Thank you so much for that. All right. What is the Berlin Codex and when is it dated? What importance does it have for New Testament scholars?
Uh, okay. So for New Testament scholars per se, it is not the Berlin Papyrus is not that important because it doesn't contain any New Testament texts. So the Berlin Papyrus was discovered in the Berlin Codex was discovered in 1896. It was discovered by a German scholar. He didn't discover it actually. He bought it. He was in Cairo, and he bought it, and it's from somebody who had it and who said it was found. And it dates from the 5th century. It's a 5th century manuscript, but it's really important for people, not for like people interested in the gospel, John or something so much, but for early Christian scholars, because it has four texts in it, including one of the most important Gnostic texts that we know of, the Apocryphon of John, which is a Gnostic text that is fundamental for understanding Gnosticism, and that was discovered in other manuscripts later in the 1940s. But the one that's really cool, that was really important, is the Gospel of Mary. This Berlin Codex contained four. It was a small anthology of 4 texts, but one of them was the Gospel of Mary, which is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And it's not that she wrote this gospel, but it's a gospel. It's another Gnostic gospel. These are Gnostic texts in them. And in the Gospel of Mary, we have an account of Jesus giving a secret revelation to Mary that can unpack the truths of the universe. And the problem is she's talking to the disciples, and she starts describing this vision that Jesus gave to her. And at that point, we're missing pages of the manuscript. It's like, all right, why would you start saying what the revelation is that he gave her? Oh my God!
And these are the mysteries.
But then it picks up again, and she's still talking about this revelation, and so we can unpack a good bit of it. And the disciples, the men disciples, one of the things that's made this really interesting, the men disciples, Peter and Levi and these other Alphaeus, they get a little ticked off, Andrew, because they're saying, why did Jesus reveal it to her? She's a woman. Why didn't he reveal it to us? And they have this big argument among themselves, and Mary calms them down, and so it's been an important gospel for in the last 20 or 30 years for people recognizing the importance of women in early Christianity, and the significance of Mary Magdalene in early Christianity. And it's this kind of really interesting, bizarre gospel.
If I may, just not to spend much time, but yes or no might even suffice. Did Mary play a much bigger role, you think, in early Christianity and was suppressed?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think so. Mary Magdalene, of course, today everybody wants to talk about it like she was the most important disciple and she was really close to Jesus. Oh boy, were they close. In fact, they had babies. You get the like in the Da Vinci Code. Yeah, that's all right. But it's weird. People don't realize this, that in the Gospels of the New Testament, during Jesus' entire public ministry, in all 4 Gospels, she's mentioned once. It's in Luke chapter 8. She and 2 other women, Joanna and Susanna, helped support Jesus and the apostles by providing them with their financial means so that they don't have to work. And that's all it says about her. But she's significant because she's in the gospel. She is the first to discover that the tomb is empty. Jesus' tomb is empty. And so historically, if that were right, that Mary Magdalene was the first to say that Jesus was raised from the dead, she'd be pretty important.
Right.
It would mean she founded Christianity. That's pretty important.
Right.
So she was important, but I don't think her importance was particularly suppressed in early Christianity.
Thank you so much. Might butcher the term here, but what is the Akhmim Codex and when is it dated? What importance does it have for New Testament scholars?
Yeah, the Akhmim Codex is another codex that comes from Egypt. This is this is one I've spent a lot of time working on the last few years. Actually, it was discovered in 1886 or 1887 by a group of French archaeologists who were digging in an area in southern, so what they call Upper Egypt, in a place called Akhmim. Um, and it Akhmim, there's some cemeteries in Akhmim. And these French archaeologists were digging these in a cemetery, and they uncovered a tomb. And in the tomb, they found a 66-page book. They thought that the person who had been buried with the book must have been a monk, because who else would be buried with the book? They reasoned, and not everybody buys that. The manuscript itself probably dates to the 6th century. It is also a small anthology of texts, 66 pages written in Greek. The first text is the Gospel of Peter, which is now one of the more better known Gospels from outside the New Testament among lay readers. A very important Gospel. We only have a fragment of it. The manuscript itself is a complete manuscript. No, it was a complete book. Like, it has the book as a whole book. But the scribe who was copying this thing, probably in the 6th century, only had a portion of the Gospel of Peter to copy. And so it begins with a blank page, and he's got a page with a decoration, then the text begins. So it's clear, it's not fragmentary, but it begins in the middle of an episode. And it begins by saying, since none of the Jews would wash their hands, Pilate stood up. And from there, you get the rest of the account of Jesus' trial. So apparently right before this, Pilate has washed his hands of Jesus' blood, which is an incident you find in the Gospel of Matthew, only in Matthew in the New Testament. And then it continues, and it gives an alternative account of Jesus' trial and his death and his resurrection. And it's and it ends, by the way, ends in the middle of a sentence. It's like right in the middle. So, but the resurrection account's really interesting. It's an important text because people don't realize this. The New Testament does not narrate the resurrection of Jesus. There's no story of Jesus' resurrection in the New Testament. What happens in the New Testament is Jesus dies and he's buried. And on the 3rd day, the women find that the tomb is empty.
Yeah, there's no watch what happened. Yeah,
there's no account. There's no account of the resurrection itself. The Gospel of Peter gives an account of the resurrection. And in this, it's a fantastic account. The Romans are afraid somebody's going to steal the body, and so they post this guard around the tomb, again, like in the Gospel of Matthew, although it's worded very differently. And as the guard is standing there watching on the 3rd day, 2 beings descend from heaven, and as these angelic beings descend, the stone rolls away from the tomb. They go into the tomb, and then when they come out, there are 3 of them, and the 2 of them are so tall their head reaches up to the sky, and the 3rd is so tall his head reaches up above the sky. They're supporting him, and they walk out of the tomb, and then behind them there comes out, I don't know if it's levitating or what, but the cross comes out. Comes out behind them, and then a voice comes from heaven and says, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" And the cross says, "Yes."
Oh my!
It's great. And so you get this giant Jesus and the walking, talking cross, and it's this like so preach to those who are asleep means has the message gone to those who had died before. Mm-hmm. And the idea here is that the message of the cross, salvation doesn't come just to those who happen to live after Jesus. The lucky us. He died for our sins. And, what about the people before him? Well,
doesn't he go to Hades or something?
The message went down to the underworld. And so people had a chance to repent down there just as they do up here. So anyway, there's that. That's one of the 4 texts. The other one that's really interesting that I've spent most of my time working on the last couple of years is the Apocalypse of Peter, which I don't need to say more about unless you want to hear. But it's the first surviving account, a Christian account, of a guided tour of heaven and hell, where Peter is shown by Jesus the realms of the blessed and the tortures of the damned. And the torture of the damned goes into great detail. It's really interesting.
Something about that they love. Thank you so much for that. Let's go to the next one. What is the Edgerton Gospel, and when is it dated? What importance does it have for New Testament scholars?
So the Edgerton, the Edgerton Gospel or the Edgerton Papyrus is one of these Gospels that didn't obviously didn't make it into the New Testament. It's sometimes called Papyrus Edgerton II because there are other Edgerton papyri. It's a small fragmentary text that has these four. It has 4 episodes in it, but it's an account of Jesus. It's a gospel. It comes from a gospel, but you don't have a complete story. You got these 4 little stories. And one of them, Jesus is confronting his adversaries, apparently Jewish adversaries, in a passage that's similar to the Gospel of John, where it tells them that they should read the scriptures because he's revealed in the scriptures. And then you've got another one where he heals a leper. And you've got, so the last one is the last episode is interesting because it's really fragmentary, and it looks like what happens is Jesus takes some seed and he sows it on water and it grows, and it's this miracle. And so the 4 passages are all similar to things in the New Testament, but they're worded very, very differently in some ways. And it was interesting when this thing was discovered in the early, when it came to be known in the early 20th century, so about 100 years ago, because the scholars who discovered it dated this fragment they had to the year 150, which was earlier than any biblical manuscript at the time. In other words, and so they started saying, look, they called it the unknown gospel, but they are saying, this is the manuscript we have is earlier than any biblical man. Is it possible that this gospel is earlier, that it was written earlier than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? At least it raises the possibility, and it still is a possibility. Although most scholars today point out that these different stories have combinations of stories from the Gospels of the New Testament. So it's more likely that it's a compilation of stories that it's heard from earlier sources, and so it doesn't necessarily mean it dates earlier. And the more recent investigations have dated it a little bit later, more to around the year 200. And now we do have biblical manuscripts earlier than that. So anyway, so that's the Papyrus Edgerton.
That's interesting history there.
Yeah.
In an earlier interview, you briefly talked about the secret Gospel of Mark and whether it could be a modern forgery. What are your thoughts about the so-called Gospel of Jesus' wife that has created such a controversy over the past decade? Unlike Mark, the actual document is available and can be directly examined and evaluated by specialists.
Yeah. Right. We don't have the secret Gospel of Mark, so we can't evaluate that. And the secret Gospel of Mark is really not an entire gospel. It's an episode not found in Mark that allegedly was originally in Mark. And so we don't have it to examine. We don't know where it is or if it exists anymore. But yeah, the Gospel of Jesus' wife is a different thing. This is a small piece of papyrus that was announced to the world by Karen King, a very fine professor of Gnosticism and early Christianity, who's now retired from Harvard. And she hadn't bought it, but the person who owned it had showed it to her. And it's just a little fragment that is that has a few lines of Jesus talking, and the narrator, and at one point it says his wife, referring to Jesus. So, whoa, and so this fellow was trying to sell this papyrus, and Karen King presented it at a international conference of experts on ancient Coptic, and I have a colleague who's there. I have several people. I know people who were there who immediately said, "This is not genuine. It's a forgery." And Karen King thought it probably was authentic, and she tried to document it, and she got people on her side. Some of the greatest scholars of ancient papyri in the world looked at it and authenticated it. Eventually, it came to be discredited and was shown actually to be a modern forgery. It appears to be an ancient piece of papyrus that somebody wrote on, like they got ancient ink or whatever they wrote on it, and they made it up. And so it has been completely discredited now, and so nobody, even Karen King, nobody thinks that it's authentic. There's a book. Oh God, I'm going to forget this person's name. He's famous. He's a journalist. The book is called Veritas, Veritas. It's this entire book is about the discovery and the unfolding of this whole papyrus and what happened and how and he established Ariel, what's his name? So, how he Sabar, Ariel Sabar. And so if people are interested in that, get the book Veritas. They can read all about it.
Yeah, there's so much fun, interesting stuff. I wonder if there's a book specifically written to actually talk about everything that has come out to be a forgery. I wonder if anything slips through the cracks that we haven't.
Yeah, well, people look into it all the time because there are lots of things, and there are lots of books about modern forgeries. There's some really interesting books your readers would be interested in on forgeries of gospels that are still influential. In the 19th century, there was a spate of books. So when people talk about like Jesus as a young man going to India and learning from the Brahmins, or like you get all these stories, these apocryphal stories about Jesus. Most of them come from 19th century gospels, and they've all been discredited. I have a chapter on that in my book called Forged about these 19th century gospels. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Bart. By the latter 2nd century, it is estimated the number of Christians in the Roman Empire had surpassed 100,000, still a small percentage of the overall population, and were concentrated in urban areas. Was Celsus the first pagan scholars known to compose a major attack against the movement, and that much of the work is preserved in Origen's reply contra Celsus? Can scholars determine how it compared to a similar book written a century later by the pagan philosopher Porphyry?
Wow. Okay. PhD exam time. All right. Bring it on. Yeah. So I would say probably 100,000 around year 200. Probably it's not wildly off, but it's it's a guess. Celsus was a pagan who attacked Christianity in writing. He wrote a book called The True Word, where he tries to show that Christianity is completely bogus. And he is, to our knowledge, the first to produce a literary text arguing this. We don't have his book anymore. 50 years, he wrote it in the 170s. About 50 years later, a very fine Christian scholar, Origen, the greatest intellectual of Christianity of the first 3 centuries, was this man named Origen from Alexandria, Egypt, and he wrote the book that you referred to, the Contra Celsus, or Against Celsus, where he quotes Celsus word for word all through this entire book. It's a big book that he wrote, and he quotes Celsus and then refutes Celsus. And so you have a pretty good idea of a lot of what Celsus actually said, because Origen just quotes him. I mean, just literally, and it doesn't look like he's manufacturing the quotes or that he's doctoring them. He looks like he's just quoting what he's got. And scholars have looked into that, of course, to see. But and then he replies to it. And so Celsus was a very bright guy, philosopher, and he thought that Christians were not very bright, so he attacks the books of the New Testament and so forth. So in the next century, we get an even more sophisticated attack by an even better philosopher, Porphyry, who was a Neoplatonist philosopher who was very, very bright. We don't have his book, and we don't have extensive quotations of his book, but we do have some Christian sources that appear to be replying to it. And so it's possible to reconstruct at least some of his arguments. But he was a very he was a high level intellectual, and it may be that his attacks on Christianity were influential at the higher reaches of the Roman Empire, leading to some of the persecutions, especially the great persecution under Diocletian. Diocletian may have been influenced by this attack on Christians by Porphyry.
Wow. Do you think there's, and just a personal question briefly, is, do you think the criticisms by Celsus are pretty valid in terms of what he's saying? If you were diving into, we'd have to kind of put on the mind of both Celsus and
Yeah.
Christianity, but do you think he had some really valid criticisms that people should go and read?
Oh, I think they should definitely read it because he says, I mean, from a pagan point of view, he makes a really good argument, and Origen's reply makes sense, makes a lot of sense to people who are Christians because he has kind of a Christian assumption of things. But Origen was his equal intellectually, at least, and but they're coming at it from very different points of view, very
Right.
different perceptions, and so whether you find him convincing or not will depend to a great degree on how on what side you personally are on. But he does, he goes after Jesus, and he says that he's this lower class guy, and that he's not well educated, and that there's a bunch of myths about him, and the Gospels tell things that could not have happened, and so he attacked Christianity the way the modern attackers of Christianity would probably do it, and Origen replies the way modern apologists would reply.
So he's a pagan, Origen's a Christian, and I'm not either. I'm neither side, I guess. So my question would be like, if I'm approaching this and looking for valid criticisms, and then reading Origen, you know how they have that wise proverb that says a man gives his argument and he seems right until the other guy gives his argument. Then you're like, crap, who's right? Because both sides are making great cases. Someone who's sitting outside of that as an atheist or agnostic, depending on how you want to approach this, reading it, would you say there's valid points on both sides and in what they're trying to argue?
What
I'm
I
not
would
saying
say is that
ontologically, but
I would say anybody who's interested in the defense of Christianity would benefit from reading the against Celsus, um, because Celsus makes some very interesting points. I mean, and Origen has interesting ways of responding to them. What my sometimes I've found that when somebody makes a controversial position, like they develop a controversial position let's say on Christianity, and then somebody takes the other position. Sometimes when the person takes the other position, you actually think, because you think, well, that's the best that can be done. Huh, I actually agree with the first guy now.
right.
So that happens sometimes too. And I think what you do is you just approach it with an open mind and try and figure out who makes the best argument. Origen won the argument in the sense that Origen, in the Christianity took over,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that he has the better argument.
Well put. Well put. Thank you so much.